Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give it another minute as people are trickling in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And while we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and post the toolkit in the chat. I will post it again throughout, but just proactively post it to start. All right. Welcome, everybody, to today's Jewish Gun Violence Prevention Roundtable webinar, Breaking the Silence, Addressing Suicide as the Leading Cause of Gun Deaths. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be available online after we finish this evening. Please put any questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to answer them all at the end, time permitting. We've developed a brief toolkit for people who want to do additional reading, which I'll post in the chat. And then the toolkit will also be included in the follow-up email with the webinar recording. So here is the toolkit again. I just want to say that today we will be discussing difficult topics. If you need to step away or engage in self-care, please do whatever you need. If you or a loved one are experiencing a crisis, please call 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Helpline. So we are going to start with a poll if I can figure out the technology. Here we go. All right, so approximately what percentage of gun deaths in the US do you think are suicide versus homicides, including mass shootings? We'll give it just another 15 seconds as people are answering. All right. Well, it seems like we have a very well-informed group here today because the majority of, or the plurality at least, of people have answered 60% suicide, 40% homicide, which is the case. That is the correct answer. And according to the National Institute of Mental Health, suicide is among the leading causes of death in the United States, with more than 49,000 people dying by suicide in 2022, double the number of people who died by homicide in that year. Like homicides, most suicides in the US involve firearms. And suicide is a public health crisis, but as a society, we rarely talk about it. Suicide has long been shrouded in stigma, which can make both people who may be experiencing suicidal ideation and people who have lost loved ones to suicide feel alone, feel shame, or feel guilt. Today, we are collectively rejecting that stigma. Our esteemed panelists are going to talk openly about suicide, about how to support loved ones, and about potential interventions. We're also going to talk about the role of firearms in suicide. And in a time when many Jews may be contemplating purchasing firearms, we will talk about the elevated risk that bringing a firearm into the home may pose not only to the firearm owner, but also to other household members, particularly young people. We know that not all suicides can be prevented, but we also know that many can. So we are honored today to be joined by four absolutely amazing panelists. Catherine Fleischer is a policy advisor at Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, where she focuses on research-driven approaches to firearm injury prevention. Rabbi Suzanne Offit, a board-certified chaplain, works toward transforming the Jewish communal response to suicide. Dr. Judy Schechter is Professor Emerita of Pediatrics at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, where she served as Department Chair and Chief of Child Health at Holtz Children's Hospital. And Dr. Jonathan B. Singer is Professor of Social Work at Loyola University in Chicago and a leading expert in youth suicide prevention. A link to their bios can be found in the toolkit, which I will post again in the chat. And now I will turn it over to Rabbi Offit to get us started.
Thank you, Rachel. A suicide is a tragic and traumatic death. A suicide loss of a loved one has a tragic, traumatic, and unique kind of bereavement. This is where I work in this deep and abiding grief. This could be the aftermath of a single moment or a long, painful journey with mental health struggles. Let me tell you about Hannah. Hannah is a mom who reached out to me. She said, "My son killed himself. Why? How? How could this happen? How could my 19-year-old son have killed himself with a gun? This doesn't make sense." Hannah wept. Hannah sobbed and sobbed. She could not find her breath. She could not find her voice. I was with her in this dark and unimaginable place until she began to breathe and find her voice. Only questions remained. How? Why? So Hannah was compelled to answer her own questions, however misguided she was. "It must be my fault," she said. I could have told Hannah that this is not true. This is not your fault. Hannah could not hear me. She was in shock. Her world imploded, and with it, everything she believed to be true was now gone. Hannah was in unfathomable suffering. Her fun-loving, talented, accomplished son was now dead by his own hand. Jews own guns. More Jews own more guns these days. Jews die by suicide. Not all suicides are preventable, but firearms increase the completion by 90%. A suicide is a perfect storm of components in a moment of crisis. What Hannah did not realize is that boys and young men are often impulsive, and their access to firearms is often a deadly combination. You'll be hearing from other experts in policy, medicine, social work, all of us addressing a formidable challenge. Yet my work is not in prevention and intervention. My work is after the nightmare has occurred. People who find me for support in their suicide grief and their hope for healing have lost friends, siblings, parents, and spouses. Yet most people who find me have lost a child, a relationship, not an age. Suicide grief is unique for the crush of unanswerable questions and the roller coaster of so many emotions: guilt, sadness, anger, anxiety, astonishment, rage, confusion, frustration, denial, and sometimes even relief. And there is isolation and shame. Shame is from the dark and heavy cloak of stigma. Stigma is so powerful. Stigma is negative, inaccurate, and unfair judgment swirling in culture. Stigma takes hold of us even without our awareness. Stigma is stronger than logic. It's stronger than intellect. It's stronger than love and care. And stigma thrives in darkness. Please help us bring light into this darkness. Suicide and suicide loss deserves compassion and care. And I tell those in my care, if you use all your energy for hiding, there is nothing left for healing. Jewish tradition implores us to attend to the suffering and to comfort the mourner. This implores us to go into dark and scary places with people. This is not easy, yet with stigma, it's almost impossible. Please know this. Jewish tradition does not support the arguments of stigma. We understand mental health as a leading cause of suicide, and we understand that people can make one bad decision in a moment of crisis. We do not vilify the dead or the mourner. I implore you, do not punish with stigma those who suffer from mental health issues, and do not punish with stigma those who love them. Do not punish with stigma those who, in a moment of crisis and access to means, made a terrible and deadly decision. both those who died and those who loved them, deserve our attention, our compassion, our listening ear, and our open heart. We all know that the worst thing is to be alone, isolated, stuck in our own fears and pain. We must care for our mourners, sit with them, listen to them. Yes, it may be uncomfortable for you, but it's nothing like the pain and anguish the mom of a dead son to suicide is feeling. If it's too hard for you, find me. And I repeat, Jews own guns. More Jews own more guns these days. And Jews die by suicide. Not all suicides are preventable, but firearms increase the completion by 90%. Thank you for being with us this evening. And my greatest hope is that you never need to find me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Offit, for sharing your wisdom with us today, your compassion with us today, your beautiful words with us today, and really grounding us in the reality of the pain that both people who are experiencing suicidal ideation and people who've lost loved ones to suicide are feeling. And thank you for everything you do to support bereaved families and to transform the Jewish response to suicide. Dr. Singer, my next question is for you. We often hear about suicide in the news, but what does the data tell us? And what do we know from the research about who's impacted?
Yeah, thank you so much. So let me start with the big picture. So in 2023, which is the most recent year that we have complete data, and for those who are not involved in data, it might seem like a long time ago, but that's part of what we're dealing with. There are data, the most recent year we have complete data is 2023. So in 2023, we lost nearly 47,000 people to gun-related injuries in the United States. And as we've talked about a couple times, suicides have consistently made up the majority of gun deaths in America, and that pattern seems to be continuing in the unofficial 2024 numbers. Now, when we look at firearm suicide specifically, we can see that it's about 60% of all gun deaths in 2023 were suicides. But it goes deeper than that, right? Over half of all suicides in 2023, 55%, involved a firearm. And this is the highest proportion that we've seen in decades. And preliminary data from 2024 suggests that it's the highest in at least 25 years. So in 2023, someone died by firearm suicide every 19 minutes. It's about 71 firearm suicides every day. Now, why are firearms such a significant factor in suicide death? It comes down to one word: lethality. Suicide attempts involving firearms have approximately a 90% fatality rate, far higher than other methods. And the lethality of the method is highlighted when you understand that firearms are used in only about 5 to 6% of all suicide attempts. So even though it's only 5 to 6% of all suicide attempts, they account for over half of all suicide deaths because they're so lethal. And so this is why restricting access to firearms is considered such an important suicide prevention strategy, especially when we know that most people who survive a suicide attempt don't try again. Now, looking at recent trends, we can see that there's an increase in gun violence. We can see there's an increase in firearms, in suicide deaths. And we can also see that there's an increase in firearm-related suicide deaths by geography and in demographics. So for example, in rural areas, 63% of gun deaths are suicides compared to 50% in metropolitan areas. So Wyoming's firearm suicide rate is about 10 times higher than Massachusetts, which has the lowest rate in the country. And when we look at who's most affected, men bear a disproportionate burden, particularly white males and American Indian and Alaska Native males. But we're also seeing some alarming changes in younger population. Youth under age 18 who died by firearm suicide, nearly 80% used a gun belonging to a family member. Now, when I talk about a youth dying by firearm suicide, you might unconsciously be envisioning a white kid with a gun. And no judgment if you do. But among Black youth aged 10 to 19, the firearm suicide rate more than tripled between 2014 and 2023. And in fact, 2023 was the second year in a row where the gun suicide rate for young Black Americans exceeded that of their white youth peers. We also see higher rates among adults over 25 with high school education or GED. Veterans face particularly high risk. 73% of military personnel suicides between 2018 and 2022 involved firearms. Now, what all these data tell us is that we have an ongoing public health crisis. And suicide is considered a preventable public health problem. Now, as Rabbi mentioned, not all suicide deaths are preventable. And certainly after somebody dies by suicide, the message needs to shift from suicide as a preventable public health problem to now let's address your grief and loss, right? And so I think it's really important to understand that these two messages can sit side by side. Now, I'm going to finish up simply by saying that these stats are really important, and we don't have good stats for suicide in the Jewish community, either in the United States or the diaspora. And that's something that is we're needing more research on to have a better understanding of what that looks like. Thank you for your time. Happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singer, for grounding this conversation in research and data and helping us understand who firearm suicide impacts and how that's been changing. So before we turn to our next panelist, we have another brief poll. All right. So we've been talking a lot about the intersection between domestic violence, or I'm sorry, firearms and suicide. So according to Bloomberg.com, in the weeks after October 7th, 2023, how much did Jewish-related gun training and purchases increase in some cities? 25%, 100%, 300%, or no change? Right, so it looks like we're split pretty evenly about what we think the answer is. In this case, the answer is C, 300%. So gun shops and Jewish groups in places such as Miami and LA reported up to a 300 to 450% increase in firearm interest. And as Rabbi Offit was saying, Jews have historically been a low propensity gun owning community, but also Jews own firearms. But with this increase in interest, it's really important that everybody knows that introducing a firearm into the home comes with inherent risks, including an increased risk of suicide. And Dr. Singer was saying that 80% of young people who die by suicide, by firearm suicide, use a family member's firearm. So, Catherine, my next question is for you. If we remove firearms from an individual who is at an elevated risk of dying by suicide, won't they just substitute other means and die regardless?
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you everybody for the time and space to talk with you today. I'm going to take the long way around to answer that, which is very much following in the Jewish tradition. So I'm going to talk a little bit about public gun violence as a public health crisis. I work in the public health space. I'm a public health professional, and I know from my work, from my colleagues' work, from our movement's work, that gun violence is definitively a public health crisis. And that, as mentioned by my fellow panelists, firearm suicide is a major component of it. So as a public health professional myself, I believe deeply that data is not a complete picture of the burden of gun violence in the United States. But I do also believe that that data can and does help us frame the issue and all of its complexities, as well as possible solutions. As mentioned by my panelists, in 2023, 58% of all gun deaths in the United States were suicides. But the way that that statistic resonates with me is that in 2023, 27,300 people died by suicide by firearm, which is one suicide by firearm every 19 minutes in the United States. And concerningly, this increase has continued even as gun homicides have decreased over the past few years, indicating that there's a need for specific solutions to prevent these losses, which I will return to in a moment. I also wanted to point out, as Dr. Singer did, that the rate of firearm suicide has increased significantly among Black and Brown populations, especially youth. Gun homicide rates among young Black youth have tripled since 2014. That's an increase of 245%. And this firearm suicide rate for young Hispanic and Latino youth has doubled, so an increase of about 98%. I also wanted to name that these rates are compounded among LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ youth of color. This is, as you all know, an extremely vulnerable population that requires our attention and care. To get back to Rachel's original question about means replacement in suicide, research shows us that few people substitute a different method for suicide if their preferred method is not available. And even if a person if a person attempts suicide by other means, they are much more likely to survive their attempt because other means are far less lethal, and that provides them the time and space to have an opportunity for change of mind or rescue as compared to attempts by firearm. A little bit more on the public health model and how that influences the way that we understand gun violence, both in its issues and its solutions. We use something called the socio-ecological model to identify and implement upstream solutions and preventative approaches to reduce rates of firearm suicide. The socio-ecological model emphasizes that multiple levels of influence take place both on individual and systems, and supports the idea that behaviors and social dynamics both affect and are affected by various contexts. And so if you kind of imagine with me a set of concentric circles, at the very center is the individual, and that's their knowledge, their attitudes, their skills, their practices. One level out is interpersonal, so influence of family, friends, household members. Next one is community and organizational. So that's our neighborhoods, schools, workplaces, religious entities, summer camps, Sunday schools, the places where we live, work, and play. And then finally, the social and political context that all of it exists in, which is our social norms, our laws, our policies, and our broader social structures. And I mention this because solutions can be identified for each level of the model. I also want to pause and reiterate what my other panelists have said, which is that effective evidence-based policy solutions don't save all lives, but they do measurably save some, indicating that these interventions are worth our attention and our investment. Evidence indicates that there's a spectrum of effective interventions that should be considered. So, we can think about safe storage and how every person that has a firearm should store it safely, which means that their firearms should be locked and unloaded, preferably in a locked, hard-sided container. And then you move up the interventions. If there are youth, prohibited person, people in crisis in a home, there might be a requirement for lethal means safety counseling or some other type of enhanced in-home security. And then kind of move up our little pyramid of interventions. If we get up to a firearm owner or household member being in serious crisis, or concerned that someone has unauthorized access to the firearm, we can look to voluntary do not sell lists when someone feels that they're at risk or someone in their home is at risk, or do not sell lists out of home storage can really help restrict that access. And then in the most extreme of circumstances, at the very top of the pyramid, we have extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOs. They're colloquially known as red flag laws. And in some situations, those are appropriate. ERPOs are civil orders that temporarily remove firearms from individuals at risk of harming themselves or others. Currently, 21 states, plus the DC and the US Virgin Islands, have these laws. And we know that these laws save lives. Regarding ERPO, research from 2024 showed that ERPOs reduce rates of firearm suicide and that one life is saved per every 17 to 23 ERPOs issued. So that's not perfect, but those are lives of our community members, lives of our loved ones. And it's worth advocating for. It's worth moving towards having these policies so that we have the tools to save lives when we know someone is in crisis. I also wanted to add that, ERPOs are, kind of at the social level, but there is also individual and interpersonal interventions like safe storage. Research from 2020 found that states with strong safe storage policies have an estimated 12% reduction in youth firearm suicide rates, which is really significant and really indicates robust support for our claim that safe storage of firearms can and does reduce unauthorized access by creating time and space between a person and their highly lethal means. And then my last note here is that, the socio-ecological model with the concentric circles that you all listen to me chat through, I appreciate, tells us that violence prevention and intervention initiatives, including the ones I mentioned, like safe storage and ERPO, along with policies we haven't had a chance to talk about, for example, firearm purchaser licensing or domestic violence firearm relinquishment, none of these can exist in a vacuum, right? So all of these effective strategies necessarily need to be paired with other policies, programs, system changes, direct services, community support. And that's where all of the other pieces that my fellow panelists have been discussing plays in, right? These are all interrelated, and the way that we're going to reduce firearm suicide rates and overall rates of suicide in the United States is by adopting these policies, providing people the services they need, and ensuring that every level of the socio-ecological model receives our attention. I'm happy to answer questions and to have a further discussion on some of these policy solutions in particular. But in the meantime, just thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for giving us some insight into responding to gun suicide as a public health crisis and spectrum of potential interventions. And again, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A box and we will answer them. Also glad to see that people are engaging in the chat. So we have one more poll before turning to our final panelist and then getting to some questions. Let's see. The poll has disappeared. It's very mysterious. Okay, instead of doing the poll here, I will just verbally share the poll. The final question that I have for the group is how quickly can an adolescent go from deciding to try to die by suicide to acting on it? And you know what? I'll just put this in the chat. Oh, I have to take out the answer before I put it in the chat. I'll just put it in the chat for everybody. Okay. So how quickly can an adolescent go from deciding to try to die by suicide to acting on it? Is it days, hours, minutes, or seconds? And put some answers in the chat. Oh, huh. I just found the polls/quizzes button moved. So it looks like a lot of people are saying minutes with a smattering of seconds and a couple hours. So the answer is C, minutes. More than 70% of youth suicide attempts occur within an hour of the decision to try to die by suicide, often within the first 10 minutes. So, Dr. Schechter, this last question is for you. We know that young people are at particular risk of suicide, as we've discussed. And as we also just learned, the time from contemplation to action can be short. Can you tell us more about this and steps that parents and families can take to reduce the risks?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Rachel, for convening all of us, and to the other panelists for laying out facts and figures and stories that are incredibly motivating. As you mentioned, suicide is something, and firearm suicide in particular, is something that happens to every race, ethnic group, every age, both genders, and everybody in between. But it is particularly for me as a pediatrician, and for many of us who think about the potential of young people, it's very painful when it happens among youth, which is an increasing population. So for people under the age of about 44, suicide is the second leading cause of death. So that's youth as we think of my pediatric population, kids under 18, but it's also their parents. So the ripple effect in families is pronounced. You really made my job easier by going through what that impulsivity that Rabbi Offit was referring to means, that the decision making for somewhere between, based on age, 50 and 70% of those who attempt suicide and come back to tell us about it because they didn't have lethal means necessarily, say that decision was made within an hour. And a quarter made that decision 5 minutes before that attempt. So it's really rather dramatically impulsive. And on top of that, they made that decision after a quick crisis. So the crisis in their life very often, particularly for young people, happens within about 24 hours. Of course, it can be longer than that, and it can be a chronic pain. But for many people it is, which underscores how important it is for us to intervene and have the means to intervene. The reason people are speaking so much about lethal means and firearms being a lethal means, Dr. Singer outlined how deadly this is once that trigger is pulled. But the other types of attempts after that, suffocation is a common one, and after that, poisoning is a common one. We can help intervene. Families can help intervene. There's time. The person who attempted it very often regrets that. The overwhelming majority say they no longer want to die. But it's too late when it's a gunshot wound, when there's other ways of doing that attempt or that try. There are ways also to intervene and give someone back their life and give all their loved ones back, this incredibly beloved person. So this becomes really important for young people who may not tell us what's going on in their life. We may not know what that crisis is. That crisis is very often a relationship breakup or an argument in the family. It might be a bad grade or not getting into college or not making the sports team that one wanted. Things that we know they can recover from. But at the time of their development, that seems like something they'll never be able to stand up again on. The access issues that are being outlined here are not just at the policy level. I appreciate the policy level to a great extent, but they're also very much in our homes and the homes of the people we visit and our relatives. We know from research that far too often we think that those accidents that happened somewhere else, or the access when I told my kid not to touch the gun, won't happen in my home. My kids aren't like that. And we know from research, including mirrored rooms where kids are in the room who've just been told, whether by law enforcement or a parent, don't touch the gun and find a gun, that they not only touch it, but they will pull the trigger. So just telling particularly kids not to do that isn't enough. And though I am a pediatrician and asked to do the youth part, I would say, let's also think about people at the other end of the age spectrum. The elderly are so much at risk, particularly elderly men. And a lot of them, their cognition is not the same. And their emotional vulnerability is not the same as it once was. So as hard as it is to have those conversations and think about what's the appropriate storage and security for this firearm for those people as well, we have to have those conversations. It's really important. I want to touch on the prevention part of this discussion, even beyond lethal means. I agree with everybody that made a statement here that not all suicide is preventable, but the vast majority of it is. It's just not always, it is not on any one person's shoulders. The way it's preventable is a comprehensive community response. So we do have to look at housing, and when people have a financial crisis, how we support them and how we avoid isolation and how we help people with access to mental health care or crisis response, and make sure that our neighbors are treated like our neighbors in our community again. That's really important. There are some tools, maybe it's in your kit already. I'm sorry, Rachel, that I don't know, but there is a national strategy for suicide prevention. It got released in 2024. It's new, sort of new-ish, but it brings together folks who are very committed to this. It really looks at the research, in fact, of the 4 major elements of that plan. Getting more research is there because there's so much that we don't know about this, so much that could help us better identify risks and mitigating factors so that we can protect our loved ones. Another aspect of that is the community response. And again, this is never on anyone's shoulders. It's on all of our shoulders. So we have to come together around that. The community prevention is number 1, because we want to intervene before this comes in an impulsive brain's thoughts, right? We want to make sure people feel supported, that we know that that they know that we're with them. And there are lots of ways to do that in the community. And the second one really is around crisis intervention and treatment. So that's raising awareness, and that 988 number that should be well imprinted in everyone's brain and on your phones. There are ways for us to do this and to do it better. The increases that we've seen, we can spend a lot of time on. I think somebody said the peak year, sort of 2022, and what happened over COVID, a little dip and a coming back. But the trend in suicide has been increasing since about 2000, and at a faster rate since about 2006, 2007. We don't have time to go into all the reasons that might be, but it should heighten our concern about this, and this in our families and our neighbors and our relatives throughout the community. So I'll take a quick look at my notes, but I think I'm going to pause there. Since I also come from science, I'll just give you 2 other numbers to think about, and they're related. The 49,000 or so in our peak 2022 suicides a year. There are 48 times attempts than there are completed suicides. So that comes to about 2.3 million people who attempt this every year. 10 times more than actually deaths are show up in our emergency rooms. So almost 500,000. This is a very costly for policy makers, right, and taxpayers, but costly in terms of the pain and the ripple effect and what is happening for us across the board. There's so much we can do. Of those who we've studied, only half have known mental health issues. So please don't ever think that this is just something for those people over there who have been identified. It really is something that is about all of us, and the solutions are about all of us. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Dr. Schechter. So I will update the toolkit with the Blueprint for Youth Suicide Prevention. It is a living document. It's on Google Docs. So once we hop off here, I'll add it and everybody will have the updated version immediately. Before I turn to attendee Q&A, I actually have one question for whoever wants to answer it. Everyone is open for everyone. If I have a family member, a friend, a loved one, a coworker who I'm concerned about. I think that they might possibly, they're having a rough time. They're acting, differently. They might, I think that they might be experiencing suicidal ideation. What can I do to support them?
Okay, I'll jump in, but I'm sure others have smarter ideas. But I think don't be afraid to ask about it. Raising the word suicide, asking somebody if they are having issues or might be suicidal or have thought about suicide is not known to be something that pushes people towards suicide, which is something we used to fear. And on this topic specifically, and given the numbers that have been shared, do ask about what's available. If this is somebody you're very close to, you can have those conversations around, have you thought about what this what you might do? And if you know there are medications they might take, absolutely ask if there's a gun in the home. If you're uncomfortable with such questions and you haven't been trained in such questions, or it's not a close relationship, get them quickly to a physician, a psychologist, other supports. If it's a kid coming to a kid, find a trusted adult to help you with that.
I think another thing to go back to something that you said in the beginning, Rachel, which is that 988 is always a resource. And it's a resource for family members who are concerned. You can say, hey, I'm concerned. I'm not really sure how to have this conversation. And you have folks around the country that are trained to have conversations like that. Dr. Schechter's absolutely right that there's some basic questions. There are trainings that are available online and for free, such as QPR. And I encourage everybody who is thinking about, well, how would I say this, to do one of the free online trainings if you haven't already done something like that. The other thing is that, and I know this as a parent, and somebody who was the president of the American Association of Suicidology, and I had to sort of acknowledge that my own kids might not come to me if they were suicidal. And so having a conversation with your community about who out there are people that your family members will talk to, and make sure that they are comfortable asking the questions. So this is that community effort for addressing suicide risk that I think is really important. It's never just you.
Thank you. So does anybody have any additional thoughts on that, or should we turn to the Q&A? All right. We have a number of questions. So the first question, and Rabbi Affet, I think this question is probably for you. Do Jewish burial traditions bar burial of suicides in Jewish cemeteries?
So like everything in Judaism, there's a spectrum of belief and practice. But the law codes show a long time ago that we understood that people had, we didn't call them mental health issues then, but we understood that most people who took their lives did because they had some kind of illness. And people are in cemeteries with all sorts of illnesses. I haven't heard lately, even from people on the very right side of the spectrum of belief and practice, barring suicides, knowing that they were definitely a result of a health issue, whether it's physical or mental. So, no barring of people that I know of in a broad spectrum of Jewish practice are barred from being buried in a Jewish cemetery because of a suicide. And call me if you have a problem, because this is the weight of stigma. This is how it works. And we hold on to these things and they make us scared and run away. So thank you for asking the question, and keep asking in broad daylight and bringing scary things like that into the light.
Rachel, you're muted.
Of course I am. Thank you. I was just saying thank you to Rabbi Offit for her answer and also to Randy for asking that question. The next question is from Elizabeth. I live in Missouri and our gun laws are really open, including a preemption measure that doesn't allow cities, counties, etc. to have stricter measures in place. Do you know of other states that have been in a similar place and have changed? I'd love to see what else we can do besides calls, emails, testimony to get better laws and policy in place.
Can jump in here. I wish that I had a straightforward answer for you, but I think a lot of it is continuing to engage with lawmakers, continuing to engage with affected parties, continuing to engage with other community stakeholders. I just by way of information, there are a handful of states that do not have preemption of local firearm laws. Those are Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York. So the vast majority of states in the country do, in fact, have preemption. If you have an opportunity to advocate for that to be changed, that's wonderful. But I think in most places, probably the most effective way to move towards change is to identify policies either upstream of violence reduction or in terms of actual intervention. So upstream, we might be looking at like housing support, or we might be looking at access to mental and physical health. We might be talking about increasing funding for various social services in the country. There are a number of things we can do upstream to help create more connected, supported communities. And then there's also, some of the policies we've spoken about. So various safe storage laws, there are a number of components that make them up, but especially strengthening prohibitions for folks who have proven that they are a risk to themselves or others. And also when folks are prohibited, whether by domestic violence prohibition, a mental health prohibitor, whether they're subject to an extreme risk protection order, actually ensuring that those firearms. So, that is something you can dig into in your state and try to figure out, what exists and be able to. I fear you will still have to write the letters and do the testimony and engage with your stakeholders. But especially if you're stuck on some of the bigger things, assault weapons bans, universal background checks, you can kind of take a backdoor into supporting, different interventions and also just ensuring that people have access to services can go a really long way.
And I'd just like to add real quick to that there are organizations like Brady, there's efforts like End Family Fire, and they focus on policy, right? They have lots of thoughts about how to address this at a legislative level. I will say suicide ends up being the only issue that I'm familiar with that really bridges the gap across the aisle in terms of politicians coming together and saying, you know what, we're going to do something about this. And one of the reasons why politicians will do something about this is if they have a personal experience, sometimes a constituent with personal experience. And so as tragic as it is, what's true is that most policy changes in the United States around suicide have happened because somebody lost a loved one to suicide. And so what I would recommend is keep your eyes and ears out for those stories. Reporters will tell them in the newspapers, sometimes problematically, but they will be there. You'll hear it in your communities. These are the kinds of things that will change the hearts and minds of politicians. And as Catherine said, you still got to write the letters, but that is one strategy that has worked around the country.
And Elizabeth, I have one thing to add. Missouri is kind of an outlier because for most people, I would say, if you're not getting results at the state level, as you said, there's a preemption law, so you can't go to the local level. But most people could go to the federal level. So if you're not getting results at the federal level, sometimes I would say, maybe invest in your state. If you're not getting results at the state level, sometimes more action and more activity at the federal level. Because of course that would apply to states as well. Except of course, Missouri is one of those outliers that says that they do not recognize federal laws that do not actually also align with state laws. And I know there was a lawsuit about that. And I'm not sure what the outcome has been. I'm not sure because it started under the Biden administration. I'm not sure if the current DOJ is continuing that lawsuit, or I've sort of lost track of it. But in most other states other than Missouri and I think Oklahoma, I would suggest also that you might see more movement at the federal level. And it might be worth investing your time and energy there. So Jessica asked about the more information on the study that found a 300% increase in interest in Jewish community in firearms training and firearms purchases. I will email you that. It is buried in my email, and if I open my email, I'm a little afraid that the whole system will crash. But I will follow up with you directly. Let's see. Okay. There was a question that about research on folks currently in military service in global Jewish communities, which Dr. Singer answered in writing. Okay. Oh, there was another question that was.
Rachel, may I jump in on the
Yes,
influence
please
of
do.
these
There's one in
policies
Braden
on the
and
Jewish
chat.
community? Thank you. One of the things that's kind of been bouncing around in my head that I wanted to emphasize too, because I think we've kind of been talking about the divide in the data between the impact on Jews and this rising gun ownership in our community. And while that is absolutely something that requires our attention, I will also emphasize that Jews access firearms elsewhere. Jews and young Jews could access firearms at a family member's home, at a family friend's home, and their own home. And it's an extremely real way to prevent firearm violence in our community by ensuring that every member of our community safely secures their firearms, knows what to look out for, and is being diligent about if someone is in crisis, getting them help, and otherwise ensuring that no one who is not supposed to have access to the gun has it. So yeah, the whole community's well-being affects our well-being.
And I'll dovetail on that just a little bit. For those who, if somebody is thinking, I'm not going to do this, I'm not suicidal, I won't do that with my gun, I don't need to secure it. There are other people around, and accidents do happen. That gun suicide is just one type of gun death or injury, but accidents do happen, or people act in through assault in ways that we don't expect. That it is still far more dangerous to have that unsecured in your home than it is than the likelihood you'll ever use it against someone invading your home.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for everything you've been putting in the chat. Thank you for the people who have shared your personal experiences with loved ones who have died by suicide. We really appreciate you sharing those stories with us and trusting us here to hold you and your loved ones in our hearts. I think we have time for maybe one more question, possibly two, we'll see. So how do we better engage our youth around the facts of firearm injury and suicide prevention to empower them to be the future of gun violence and suicide prevention? And then also at a time when we see both rates of gun ownership and rates of firearm suicide increase, how do we empower our next generations to understand, counter, and thrive in this difficult reality? So these are both questions about the young people who are experiencing this today and who are our leaders in the future, now and in the future.
Well, I mean, I think as has been mentioned, when we think about universal prevention, when we think about addressing an entire population, part of suicide prevention is hope promotion, right? We want people to have a world that they want to live in. We want them to feel like their life is worth living. And if you address that, then you reduce the likelihood that they're going to be suicidal. And so you reduce the likelihood that they would seek out methods for suicide. So that's a very basic thing. In terms of how they learn about firearms and lethality, I think the prevention piece is it includes having programming in schools. Since this is a Jewish webinar, I would say that all rabbis, right, anybody on a pulpit needs to address this in their devars. They need to be talking about it so that it's not something that only comes up when somebody is concerned that you might be having a problem, right? That's the stigma that Rabbi was mentioning earlier. So you want to normalize the conversation, and then I think the other thing that we have no control over, although some people have tried to address this, is you get social media influencers to talk about it. Several years ago, there was a rapper named Logic who did a song about the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is now 988. And, calls went up hundreds times more because of that. And so people got the word out. And so I think that there's other parts of it that, again, we don't have control over, but can affect it.
Those are such great points. In public health, we sometimes get impatient with education. Policy, design change are faster levers with big impact, but education works. So to Dr. Singer's point, like, we have to have the conversations with young people. The conversations have to have plenty of time, as you've given us here today, Rachel, for questions, and to hear those questions as super serious and deserving their time and space. But education worked to drop the tobacco usage among young people. And now we see that millennials and folks who are younger aren't using alcohol at the same rates as baby boomers and others, right? So young people will respond to true facts. Let's do the research. Let's give it to them. Influencers are great, but let's also have those conversations so that they can have their questions addressed.
And one thing I'll add before I just wrap us up is that a lot of time, it's really important to involve young people talking to young people, right? Because young people, they're the ones who know their community, know their peers, and know what will be effective, and know how to have those conversations. So as Dr. Singer was saying, that might be, online campaigns that are run by young people. And it's also, as everybody has been saying, empowering young people to talk to other young people. So I'm afraid we have come to the end of our time together. I have learned so much today, and I have really been honored to be joined by all of these amazing experts in this topic. So thank you so much to our amazing panelists for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. And thank you to all the participants for spending your Wednesday evening with us. If you have further questions, I will drop my email in the chat and you can email me and I will share the questions with the panelists and someone will get back to you. And then I will update also, as I promised, the toolkit, which I have just put the link in again, with the also with the teen line information, as well as the other information that we organically had provided to us today. So thanks again to everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you.